Oh, I can see people at the top. I can see people who are attending. I don't know if I never noticed that before. So what you're saying is even though I can see their names, that doesn't necessarily mean they can see me? Because like, look, do you see what I'm saying? You see up there? Christopher, Guillermo. I think that's kind of like but does it mean they can see me? Yes. It does. Yes, they can see that, whatever that screen is. Oh, they're looking at this, actually sitting. They're looking at whatever, like that. Oh, whatever's on my, okay. So now they can see what you're looking at. All right. All right, guys, looks like we started on time. Great, thank you so much. Oh, wow, attendance, look at that. I checked my email before coming to class. I didn't hear too many people say they weren't coming. I hope this is not because of COVID or anything. Only 3 people. All right, we'll do the best we can. So, welcome back, guys. It is delightful to see you as usual. Okay, where are we? We are in the 3rd week of class, right? This is the 3rd week of class. We are covering, or is it the 4th week? 4th week, okay. We are covering still this exploring what God is, his nature, his existence, things like that. So we're on the general topic of the existence and the nature of God. And some people might say his nature kind of involves existence. That's the last argument we saw, that to talk about God's nature as if it's this whole different thing from his existence, well, depending on what philosophical approach you take to God, that's kind of like a false distinction. If you really think it through, the way Anselm does in the ontological argument, the proper ontological understanding of God will imply that the kind of being he is the kind of being that has to exist. One of the properties of that kind of being is that it has to exist, because since that kind of being is a perfect being and has all perfections, then how could it lack one of the best perfections, which is to be real? Reality is a kind of perfection. All right, guys, that was Anselm. Today, what we're going to accomplish today, you have your first essay coming up. Good news. I'm giving you an extension on the essay, so you have more time. So, today is September 9th, right? 14 days from today, on September 23rd, that's when your essay is due. September 23rd. Now, I will send out an email to just clarify a few things, but bottom line is I cannot accept any paper submissions. So pretty much just send it to my email. That's where you should send it to. All right, but I'll send out a Blackboard announcement to remind you of that. Submit it by email to my email. And that's that, guys. By midnight on September 23rd, you just submit it and then you're done. So our goal today is a couple of things. We got to get through this assignment. I want to explain it thoroughly. You know why? Because all the other assignments are going to be exactly the same format, just with different topics. So if you really understand what I expect on this one, then you'll also understand what I expect on all the other ones. It's just going to be variations on the same theme, okay? So we're going to get through this. We're going to discuss this assignment, really make sure you understand what's expected. Then we're going to discuss a logic outline. I've condensed what you really need to know about logic into 2 double-spaced pages. I'm giving you the pure essence. This is not a class in logic. I just want to expose you to it so that you can appreciate a bit why philosophers do use it as one of their resources, why it's in the toolkit. You don't have to use it. I don't expect this in your essays. I don't expect arguments or logic in your essays, but I do want to expose it to you, because if you come up with a really nice argument and you want to use it in an essay, hey, more points to you, right? But I don't expect it. Then we're also going to look at how to write a traditional philosophy paper today. Again, I'm exposing you to that so that you'll know how philosophy papers typically, hey, you'll understand how philosophy papers typically differ from other essays. They're basically essays, but philosophy papers have a very elegant format, and you might want to use it in some of your essays. I don't know, it depends on how you approach the questions. But I just want to expose you to it because, guys, I mean, professional and academic philosophy has certain standards, and some aspects of it can even be cookie cutter, because when you have professionalism, you have standards, right? So certain things are standardized. And so, I do want to expose you in case you get interested in academic philosophy or something like that. You'll know what a standard philosophy paper looks like, all right? And then finally, guys, we'll get into, the readings for today, which is continuing this theme of the nature and existence of God, but this time from other philosophers and other arguments. And if we have time after all that, then maybe we can do some inspiration or go through more of those lecture note summaries. But right now I want to prioritize getting you ready for the essay, okay? All right. Okay, guys. So let's go. Your first assignment is the nature and existence of God. The nature and existence of God. I want you to think deeply about what we've been covering so far, right? We've talked about what philosophy is and why it's important and how it's a mission and a vocation for some. Now I want you to start zooming in on some of the content that philosophers deal with. And honestly, one of the biggest topics, obviously, is God, what kind of nature he has, what kind of essence, what is God, and whether or not he exists. So this first assignment is about the nature and existence of God. It must be between 3 and 4 pages double-spaced. I don't expect any kind of citations or any bibliography or anything. The paper or essay is due on September 23rd by midnight in my inbox, my UMiami inbox. This is worth 25% of your total final grade. You understand that, right? Because you have 4 assignments? Okay. So this is one of those 4. So that's a quarter, that's 25. And that 25% is further broken down into 5% for each question. There are 5 questions in this assignment, and each question is worth 5% of the 25% that makes up your grade for this assignment. Okay, guys, I need to say something very, very important. From what we know about philosophy and how I've introduced it to you, it should become apparent to you by now that philosophy might be wonderful and rich and all that, but it's not necessarily a science or mathematics, right? Now, what does that mean? Objectivity, right? If you claim that God exists, I cannot give you a lower grade because of your conclusion. You understand that? I don't know. What I will be looking for is for you to, this is going to be a little bit more like art. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to be a bit more like art than science. I want you to express yourself, pour your heart and soul into it, passion, whatever you want. But I want you to argue your case, okay? I want you to support your conclusion in a logical way. That doesn't mean an actual argument, but it does mean something like, we're going to get into what a usual paper of philosophy looks like, but it does mean something like not just pure emotion or pure passion. Many philosophers in the history of philosophy have been very passionate, very artistic, very religious. So I cannot sit here and pretend like logic is just this, technical. Every philosopher is a technician who knows how to, technically handle concepts, and it's like mathematics or something. No, I'm sorry. A lot of philosophy is very passionate, very creative, very artistic. Now, the thing is, rhetoric and expression, those are ways of getting your point across. Now, you can organize your paper in such a way that you direct the reader through your flow to a certain conclusion. And it might be full of examples and reasons, some distinctions, some principles you introduce. And so long as you guide the reader to that conclusion with all that you have, whether it's logic or passion or whatever, that's what I'm looking for, okay? I want you to support your conclusion the best way you can. We're gonna talk about how to write a philosophy paper in a minute, and I'm gonna tell you some of the resources you can use that are typically used in supporting an argument. But I don't want you to get the impression that, okay, if I suspect that he's a Christian, I better, prove the existence of God or something like that. No. If you are an atheist or whatever you are, be yourself if you want to, and then just fight for it. You see what I'm saying? Fight using everything you've got, logic, passion, whatever. Make sure you answer all 5 of the questions. Make sure you address each one of the questions, and you reach a conclusion that answers them, and you support it. And here are the questions. Do you believe God exists? Now, that is a question that has a yes or no answer. I will give you 5 points just for saying yes or no. Okay? Now, the next one, why or why not, a yes or no is not going to be sufficient. Now you've got to get into, what do you think when someone asks you why you believe what you believe, what's the name of the type of thing that you give in response to that? If your boss says, why were you late? What do you give him? What would you call the thing that you typically give him? Yeah, an explanation, a reason, right? I was late because I got caught in traffic. I was late because my car broke down. I was late because I had a family emergency. So here, do you believe God exists? I really want to see, and you don't even have to reach a conclusion. There aren't just atheists and theists, right? Can anyone think of another position you can take on the existence of God? Atheism, theism, then what? Agnosticism, very good. You might say, I don't have the intellectual and cognitive resources to reach a conclusion. That candor and that humility and that honesty, I'll appreciate it. And I'll support it. Support why you think either you in particular or we as human beings don't have the resources. All right? So do you believe God exists? Answer that. Why or why not? Okay, that's a separate question. Answer that. That's going to take a few sentences, maybe even a few paragraphs. Remember, you only have 3 to 4 pages to answer everything. What is the epistemology or theory of knowledge that would help us figure out or determine whether God exists? Guys, what are we working with? We have senses, right? Eyes, ears, taste, smell, touch. Are those the kinds of things that will help us figure out whether God exists? We also have reason, right? Which deals in concepts and the implications of these concepts. Is that the kind of thing? Is that the theory of knowledge we need? So starting with reason rather than the senses? Is it something like, emotion? If you go through a really emotional period in your life, you can come to the conclusion that God exists from, the transition from being depressed into some kind of joy or something. Can that feeling of redemption or something, is that how you support the idea that God exists? Or finally, is it something we haven't talked a lot about in this class, something like revelation, right? Have you had a personal experience with God and he revealed himself to you and you have good reason to believe that this was a genuine, authentic religious experience, and it has nothing to do with hallucinations or that blunt that you smoked last night. Okay? What is the nature or essence of God? This question is, you must answer this question independent of whether or not you're an atheist. The nature or essence of God is not asking you about whether he exists. The nature or essence of God is just asking you, even if you're an atheist, what do you understand by the concept of God? All right? I need you to dig a little deep and really come up with it. Okay? And then finally, is God necessary for life to have meaning and substance and value? I want you to think deeply about that, right? And I'm going to give you a little hint. One way to approach that question is to think deeply about whether God is necessary for ethics. Right? If God gives no commandments, if there are no commandments about anything, could we still have objective ethics in that world where God gives no commandments? Or is divine command theory the theory that God's commandments are what make things objectively right and wrong, makes our values objectively valid? Is that where we get our real ethics from, right? And so if we go through an existential crisis where people don't believe in God anymore, is there a way to save our culture from nihilism and just complete suicidal tendencies because life has no meaning? Do we have the resources through other parts of culture than religion, like art and science and philosophy and history, that kind of thing? Or once God is gone, do you believe what Dostoevsky probably believes, right? Do you believe what Tolstoy believes? Once God is gone, that's it. All things are permitted, right? Without God's commandments, all things are permitted, and therefore we're gonna go back to being like animals, eating each other, cheating on one another, because there are no boundaries. Guys, do you have any questions about this assignment? Sorry, what? No, you don't. No. This is about you. All you need for this class is the readings and the resources I give you and your own convictions, your own ideas and feelings. This is not about secondary sources. I mean, you can quote primary sources, but you don't have to cite them. There isn't enough space anyway. It's only 4 pages. Go ahead.
Can you go over the specifics of number 3 again? I'm still kind of struggling with that.
Okay. What is the epistemology or theory of knowledge that would help us figure out or determine whether God exists? If you say that all knowledge comes from experience, and by experience you mean senses, that is a theory of knowledge. You're saying every single idea in my mind comes from the external world filtered through the senses. That is one theory of knowledge. That is one theory of knowledge. Now, can someone who has that theory of knowledge figure out whether or not God exists? If he takes everything, his eyes, ears, nose, smell, touch, can you figure out that, yeah, there is such a thing as a God working with that? Or if you look at another resource that we have, reason, right? So we can handle concepts and look at their relationships, implications, and things like that, right? Is that how you figure out whether or not God exists? And how exactly do you do it? How can you start from a concept or a group of concepts and figure out that God has the status of real or existent? And then finally, what I was telling you earlier, we haven't talked much about this, but people do have personal religious experiences that they tend to call revelation. A lot of our scriptures come from people like Prophet Muhammad or Jesus or Apostle Paul, who have had direct revelations of God. Now, if you choose that route, if you say, I can know God directly through an intimate mystical experience, or through going through a depression and then coming out of it, all that emotional stuff, you're going to have to convince me that you can get from that emotional turmoil or that emotional high, you can go from that to the conclusion, therefore God exists. Or if you have a revelation, right? God reveals himself to you, either through scripture or directly, you have some work to do. You need to explain how that's possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess is it okay if there's a little bit of overlap between 2 and 3 then? Because those 2, I mean, actually, might be.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The why God exists, you're supposed to say why in the sense of telling a story about why you think he has that status of existence or reality. But that's kind of different from saying, now what theory of knowledge supports that story you just told? You see what I mean? Go ahead.
Yeah, because I was thinking of, for example, if one were to argue for God and we use, for example, the ontological argument, does that fall under number 2 and then as the number 3 that you're acknowledging would be what, a logical argument?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So good. So number 2 in your case, let's assume someone says God exists. So they say, do you believe in God? You say yes. So I'm assuming that means you're a theist. So now why are you a theist, or why do you believe God exists? Now you would say something like, well, I believe God exists because, you could say something about the kind of evidence that you think is valid. You could say something about the resources you're working with, and that's at number 2. Number 3 is going to make it explicit that you need to support number 2, why you believe in God, by, I'm basically asking you guys to come up with your own theory of knowledge, but you don't have to be creative. You don't have to think outside the box. You can just repeat what everybody would do, senses, reason, faith, whatever, but do it in a rigorous way. You know what I mean? Like, do it thoroughly. Convince me that just by faith alone, you can somehow know that God exists, even though faith typically is kind of like the absence of evidence. You know what I mean? But if you can do it, try. Right?
So is this more just like what we believe personally, or are we just trying to prove it in general through whatever we think?
What's the distinction between those 2 things? I think they're the same, right?
Well,
Because I'm asking.
Is it more our opinion related, or is it more just a yes or no question, and the rest are just kind of citing what other people were?
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, I want you to.
Or do you want more of our own opinion?
Yeah, I kind of want you to get into it. I want you to dive into it. The first question is going to commit you to something. And guys, you can take this how you want. You can just play along and make an arbitrary choice and see how it works out for you. I'm not saying you can't do that. I would prefer if you gave it some serious thought, committed yourself to a yes or no, or I don't know, and then work through the questions that are going to kind of, kind of help shape or mold your, you understand what I'm saying? Each one of those questions is a filter that's shaping your thought. It's saying, okay, so you're committed to this, now why? And then what theory of knowledge supports it? And then what are we even talking about when we say God anyway? And then finally, okay, if he has this status of non-existent, what is the implications for axiology and for existentialism? So I would love for you to have an authentic engagement with the questions, where you're not just choosing randomly and seeing what happens. I think that would be better for you. I would love to hear. I'm gonna read what you've written closely, and all I'm gonna do is give feedback about, wow, this wasn't as clear. You did a good job here. What does this mean? Could you say more? That's what I'm gonna give you back. And I'm not gonna take off points unless I just get the feeling that you didn't answer the questions or something like that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Would you rather read like one cohesive essay in first flow, or do you want to simply just keep the almost use it as a template, keep the questions there and just like write?
Yeah. I haven't thought as deeply about that as I should. A really good essay has a flow, like you said, and it sounds like a work of art, and that would be good. On the other hand, I want to make, the reason I separated them out like that is because, your attention, I want you to see, okay, I got to answer this, and this is different from that, so I got to make a separate paragraph for this, you know what I mean? Separating them out keeps you conscientious about answering all the questions and answering them distinctly from each other. So you know what?
I think it would be difficult to do it. Something so that's thinking like thesis would be hard because like you're entering time for questions on how.
Exactly, yeah. We're about to talk about how you would write a completely unified, continuous essay. We're about to talk about that. And you can borrow some of those ideas to use here, but I'm perfectly happy if you go a few paragraphs for each one of those, and you separate them off by question, like question 1 and then paragraph, question 2, paragraph. I'd be happy with that. But if you feel inclined to really be creative and spontaneous and to unify it into an artistic whole, I will not take points off for that. In fact, if it's really good, I'll add points. So it's composition, guys. You know what composition is, right? You're composing an essay. Here you're composing it in parts, but like she said, I'm giving you the option to compose a complete whole. Other questions? Do you feel confident about it? Do you feel like I've prepared you to handle this kind of thing? All right, good. All right. Okay, now I want us to go to a new part of the course documents I've opened, and here on. So I want to show you something. So this is Blackboard. First thing I want to show you is where the assignment is. Do you see where it says assignments on Blackboard? Did everyone see that? Yeah, okay. So that's where I'll be putting all the assignments. The first one is already there. The only piece of information I haven't included is how to get it to me, but that's by email, by midnight of the 23rd. Okay. All right, so that's where the assignments are. Now let's go to the course documents. Do you see something new called reference material? Okay, let's open up reference material. All right, guys, so we have a logic outline, and we also have something called how to write a philosophy paper. Both of those are resources for this essay you're about to write and all the future ones. You don't have to follow everything in them, but it's just a resource that I've customized for this class, okay? All right, let's look at the logic outline first. Okay. So the logic outline. Let's go through it, guys. It's really short, but I think it'll be pretty sweet for us to go through this because you'll start to get a feeling for just how delicate and subtle this thing we call thinking can be. We use the word thinking we use words like thinking and thought very casually, but the good thing about philosophy is it helps you think about what thinking really is, and things get a little technical, but you won't get overwhelmed. I've simplified it for you, so let's go. What do you understand by logic? Whenever you've heard this word logic, what does it mean? Someone says, you're being illogical, or I don't follow your logic, or what are they talking about, logic? Because remember, in this class, we really talked a lot about metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and existentialism. But a lot of those people, don't really use logic a lot. They write very passionately. People like Rousseau, Pascal, Kierkegaard, St. Augustine. These are people who pour their hearts and souls out, and they are persuasive, but they're not really using logic. But there are other philosophers who do use logic. People like Aristotle, Parmenides, people like St. Thomas Aquinas, people like Descartes, who we're going to see soon. And logic gets really, really heavy in something we call analytic philosophy, which is a philosophy that was born with philosophers like Frege and Russell and G.E. Moore and the early Wittgenstein, all the way through the Vienna Circle and through Karl Popper. These are people who have been very influential in Anglo-American philosophy. Anglo-American philosophy is very heavily analytic, and analytic means it's very argumentative. It's focused on conceptual approaches to solving philosophical problems and things like that. Whereas there's another type of modern contemporary philosophy that's more associated with continental Europe rather than England and America, and that's called continental philosophy. And there the approach is a lot more creative and spontaneous and kind of literary. So a lot of the great continental philosophers write very passionately, like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Hegel to a certain extent. People like Derrida and Foucault. Yeah, those are like the continental philosophers. And they don't use logic that much. They take a much more subjective and intuitive and perceptive approach to solving philosophical problems or making contributions to philosophy. So yeah, guys, what do you guys think when you hear the word logic? What is it? Go ahead. Yeah, very good. That is excellent. Yeah, God, that's a perfect way to summarize it. You have a progression or an order or a sequence that you go through. What is it? You go from certain assumptions, and hopefully if your argument is a good one, those assumptions and their structural relationship to each other will persuade you or naturally force you to progress and go in a certain order to reach a certain conclusion, right? That's exactly what's going on. You have a certain order or a certain structure between certain statements, and that structure itself takes on a very interesting phenomenon. There's a kind of necessity, right? You set things up properly, and then your assumptions lead necessarily to a certain conclusion. If the assumptions are true, then the conclusion must be true, all right? So when we talk about logic, we're talking about the art of designing good arguments like that. And you can design all sorts of good arguments. Let's look at some. So what is logic? This is a logic outline. You could call logic the art of thinking, right? Of course, we mean good thinking, right? But it's learning how to think about things, how to be very transparent and clean and neat and tidy, be very precise. Guys, a lot of times people argue with each other, quote unquote argue, and they have no idea exactly what they're saying. They haven't been patient enough and kind of introspective enough to say, what exactly am I saying? You know, people are fighting over whether or not God exists or not, but have they even laid out what the definition of God is? You know, it's in that definition that you become conscious of exactly what you're claiming and also the implications, what you're committing yourself to when you say God exists, right? All right. So a logic outline involves the art of thinking, You can think of it as the art of argumentation and persuasion. Now, this word persuasion gets tricky because Aristotle was a great philosopher who studied logic thoroughly. And he saw that if you want to persuade someone effectively, it's true that logic can help, but there's other things as well. For one thing, you have to have good language. Like, your language has to be grammatical. If your language isn't grammatical, the person isn't really going to understand you. So in addition to logic, you need to have good grammar. But once you got the grammar and the logic down, there's this other thing, rhetoric. Have you heard this word rhetoric before? When people in politics say, oh, the rhetoric on the left is unbearable. That rhetoric of political correctness is unbearable. Or the rhetoric on the right is intolerable. It's so narcissistic or lacking in empathy or whatever. When they talk about rhetoric in that sense, they're still talking about a feature of language. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric are all features of language. But rhetoric gets interesting because what you're doing with rhetoric is you're trying to persuade someone, but you're trying to persuade someone through their emotions. So a good rhetorician will do things like, as he's in front of you, he'll appeal to his sense of authority over you, right? If someone comes up to you and says, for the past 25 years, I have been a professor at this university and I have published in all of the famous journals around the world. Is any of that grammar? Is that grammar? It's not grammar, right? That's not logic either. That is rhetoric. He's trying to get in your minds that, oh, I'm dealing with an authority. You get it? He's well published, he's well respected, he has a PhD. You see how he's playing on your emotions? So he's setting you up so that later you'll be more receptive. Why? Because he's the expert, right? That's rhetoric. We're not going to study that in this class, but it's a very important topic, especially in politics, right? You can see why. If someone goes to a political speech or a political rally, it's not going to be the logic that's going to do most of the work. It's going to be how that person makes you feel about them, how that person refers to certain people, right? Whether they choose politically correct or politically incorrect references. You see that? You see how that's playing on your emotions, right? If someone chooses to refer to you as an illegal, criminal alien, that's going to give you a very different feel than if he refers to them as an undocumented, industrious worker. Do you see that? That person is setting you up to judge things a certain way, using the rhetoric that they use. Okay, I think that's enough about that. But this is important, guys, because we call logic the art of thinking, but guess what? Notice what rhetoric suggests, that thinking is largely also emotional, right? A lot of your thinking gets done by how words are used, the metaphors, the phrases. Your soul is very rich, and only one part of it is logical. There's a whole world of irrational but beautiful ways your soul can be persuaded of things. Do you see that? All right. So we're just studying logic today. The art of thinking, the art of argumentation, designing good arguments, and persuasion. And it's also the art of reasoning or inference. We talk about reason, right? What is reason? What is it to reason about something? Well, reasoning is kind of the same as thinking. It's like a synonym, I guess. If you say, this is a piece of good reasoning, this person has reasoned well about something, or this person has made a good inference. They have inferred something correctly. That means that they have, like you said, like Alessandro said, that means that you have progressed properly from one set of statements to another. Okay? You've gone in order, and the order makes sense, and it's a natural, logical, reasonable progression. You didn't jump from one statement to another, and no one knows how you got there. All right, now, next step. This is deep, guys. How much thought is conceptual and inferential versus how much thought is perceptive and intuitive? This is deep. This is going to challenge the limits of whether or not most good thinking is even logical at all. Remember what I said about rhetoric, right? How much of your judgments of things comes from, inference and logic, things like that? How much of your judgments of things comes from inferring, looking at implications, being a detective and looking at clues that might give you an implication of what's happening or who the suspect is? That's conceptual stuff. How much thought is like that? And then how much thought is perceptive and intuitive? Guys, what is an intuition? What is a perception? Have you heard this word intuition before? If you say he is very intuitive or she is very intuitive or women are very intuitive, what are you saying? Seems to me you're saying that they think, but it's not, I don't think it's logic. Exactly. You just know that someone is a sketchy character or a suspicious character. You can perceive them. Or maybe someone has an anger, like a temper problem, right? Do you infer that this person has anger management issues, or do you just perceive it? How much of what we call data and evidence is just perceived? You can make your judgment based on perceiving the data or perceiving the evidence. And how much goes beyond perception and measurement and observation and goes now to, okay, now that we've got all the data in, it seems like the hypothesis that is implied by this data is that evolution is true, or everything is made of atoms, or something like that. Do you see the contrast I'm building? Excellent. Yeah, it's that. Because guys, we're not going to get into it a lot in this class, but I love the fact that that means you're following me very closely. How much do we know subjectively? In our current world, subjectivity is kind of like laughed at or dismissed, right? Oh, yeah, that's you. That's according to you. You don't like peppermint. You don't like Starbucks. So that's you, right? And it's kind of almost suggested that you're not thinking if you're thinking subjectively. But I want to suggest what Alessandro is saying. That's wrong. Subjectivity is a type of thought. And subjectivity does have its kind of truth. You know what I mean? There are certain truths that are subjective. You're not thinking any less just because you're thinking subjectively. Do you know what I mean? People might attack you and say, oh, you're the only one that thinks that way. So they're trying to demean your status, the status of your thoughts, by saying, oh, yeah, clearly he's the only one in class that believes in God. So they're going to make you ashamed of it or something like that. Yeah, it's just his own subjective opinion, Whereas the objective, right? The stuff that all the scientists in the world agree on conventionally, they're going to treat that with a different status. They're going to say, oh, that's objectively true. That's a fact. It's just a fact that we are multicellular organisms. It's just a fact that everything is made out of elements and compounds, right? And you're not supposed to be able to resist that with your subjectivity. You're supposed to kind of submit to these objective facts, because that's where the quote-unquote legitimate thinking is done. Not all that subjective stuff. But I want to suggest to you that if you consider something beautiful, if you think God is the most beautiful thing in the world, if you have a significant other and you're in love and you think that that person or that love affair is the most beautiful experience you've ever had, or if you have an infant and you look at their smile and your heart stops beating and you're like falling over because the cuteness is just too overwhelming. Those experiences, I want to suggest to you, are thoughts. And there are truths there. It's just that they're subjective truths. And there's one way of reading the history of philosophy where there's been a clash between these objective truths and these subjective truths. Some people might tell the history between religious philosophy and scientific philosophy as the clash between subjective and objective thinking, right? One person says, I don't see no God on my instruments. Have you ever seen a God under a microscope or a telescope? All the scientists agree, and all of a sudden we start to feel burdened, like, I guess I need to agree, right? No one has ever seen God. But then think about the other side. Someone like Kierkegaard or Pascal says, faith is how I access God, and faith is a subjective passion. And the very intensity and brilliance of that passion is a kind of evidence of God. But you know, it's not knowledge. It's not knowledge. It's not a justified true belief. But that very subjectivity, the weight of your own subjectivity, causes you to rebel against all of that objective stuff. And you raise your voice even louder and you say, there is a God. And I have a conviction that comes from my subjective thoughts. I have discovered subjective truths, and a life of faith is a life without evidence. In fact, Kierkegaard says, you take a leap of faith, you abandon reason, and that's how you fall right into the lap of God. This is not a sermon, people. So, how much thought is conceptual and inferential? Please think deep about this, because this is going to set you up to appreciate existentialism. The last thing we're going to talk about in the class is existentialism. And like I said, it's going to be a clash between the people who think that objectivity is how you establish the value of life versus subjectivity, right? Which one? How do you establish the value of life? Do you come around in a democracy and vote on it? Is that how you figure out whether life has any value? Or is it that subjective intensity, right? You've been through a few things, a few trials and tribulations, and you feel like God has got you through, or your faith in God has got you through. That's all subjective. But it's also a kind of evidence. It's not objective evidence, but it's a kind of evidence. Absolutely. Is truth subjective or objective? Someone like Kierkegaard or Pascal would say there are two types of truth. They're the types of truths that you need to kind of, manage things in the world and manipulate them. That's objective truth, because you need to be able to agree with others so that you can work in communities. But there's another type of truth that's entirely private, and that's how you get through life. That's how you get through the vicissitudes, the ups and downs, the trials and tribulations, and that's an entirely different type of truth, right? All right, guys. So, for example, can we infer beauty or truth or goodness, right? If you look at an object, you have to do logic to figure out whether it's beautiful or good or true. You need to design an argument to figure out whether this bag is ugly or whether the stars or the Milky Way is beautiful. Is that how you figure out whether or not the Milky Way is beautiful? Or is it perceptive and intuitive? Do you just look up at the stars on a cloudless night, take it all in, and you just enjoy the sublimity? I mean, you might be perceiving through your eyes, but not in that vulgar sense of like the senses. There's something else going on when you have that feeling of, oh my God, I'm looking at the heavens. When you get poetic, when you can't help but express yourself in poetry, you are looking at the stars, but I don't think it's with your eyes. But this gets into metaphysics, right? What are you? Are you your body? When you use your eyes, are you just using electrochemical patterns going through your eyeball to your cerebrum, or I don't know, something like that? Or something else going on? Do you have something like a soul? And when you look at the stars, you're engaging in the activity of perceiving them. Your soul gets happy at perceiving all that beauty. I'll leave it there, something for you to think about. Examples of arguments. Here's some examples of arguments, guys, so that we know exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about arguments. One type of argument is something like this. Only things with a human anatomy and physiology can think. Therefore, computers cannot think. That's an example of an argument. And it's also an example of an argument that a lot of philosophers are interested in. I'm using examples that are, kind of current in the industry, current in academic and professional philosophy. So yeah, guys, that's an example of an argument. A lot of people, a good number of philosophers would actually agree with that conclusion. They would say that's a pretty good argument. But now, how do you engage with that? Let's really go deep. How do you engage with something like that? And by engage, I mean like this, critical thinking, right? Okay, I see what he's saying, but how do I distance myself from it? And then kind of like, now, is this a good argument? And now, what makes it good? Or is it a bad argument? And what makes it bad? So let's think a little deeper about this. Only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. Let's just stop right there. Why would someone say that? Only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. There's something very unique about our species that might make you think that we're the only ones that can think. Can you think of what it is? Yeah, go ahead. There it is. And I like the fact that you said complex too. That's really precise. Yeah, complex language. See, here's the thing, guys. Bees have sophisticated dances that they do to communicate directions to the nectar and stuff. I think dolphins have sophisticated language a little bit, and so do apes. But what you said, complex language, we seem to be the only species that really has this level of sophistication. And so you might think, okay, the only beings I've ever encountered that do what we call thinking, whether that's logic or rhetoric or even grammar, the only beings that I've ever encountered that do that kind of thing are beings that share the same anatomy and physiology as me, in other words, humans. Now, first of all, is that true? How would we figure out whether or not that's true? How many people have you even met in your life? How many people have you read about? How many official studies about thinking among humans have you read? You see how this now becomes relevant? Because if we're going to approach this, it's a burden. Like I said, philosophy is a big care. It's a burden now. Now we got to be like, okay, now I got to sort through all this. Only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. So that word only is limiting, right? Only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. So you're excluding a whole bunch of stuff, and now the burden is on you to justify that exclusion. Do you see that? You just excluded a whole bunch of stuff. Now what right, what entitlement do you have to do that? And what kind of theory of knowledge are you using to do that? How many people have you met in your life? Is it over 100? Is it 1,000? If your Facebook friends, if the number of your Facebook friends right now is 1,000, is that sample size sufficient for you to reach this kind of conclusion that only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think? What kind of sample size would you have? Is there any human being that is currently alive or has been alive in the past or will be alive in the future who will have a sample size large enough so that he can say only the human beings I've met are the ones who think? I hope you see the burden, right? Like if you're really going to think about things, you might not make progress. You might not even get started if you take things seriously. And by the time you start talking about proofs for God, I mean, your head should be exploding. All right, so only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. Who knows how you establish that? But let's just assume it. Let's just assume it for purposes of simplification. So let's just assume that's true. Only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. And then they go from that all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to this. Therefore, computers can't think. Now, how did they get there? What's the logic behind that? How do you go from only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think to therefore computers can't think? How did he get there? We need a map or some sort of like trail. How do we follow that trail? Because it looks like a jump to me. There's something missing. Can you see what's missing? There's an unstated statement that we might call an assumption. There's a hidden assumption right there. Can you see the assumption? Let's read it. Only things that the human anatomy and physiology can think. Therefore, computers can't think. What's missing? There's a step. Only things that the human anatomy. Yeah, go ahead. Yes, that's it. Yes, exactly. And another way of saying what you just said is, okay, so here we are. Only things that the human anatomy and physiology can think. And then what you said, repeat what you said, the last thing.
That humans are the only ones with human anatomy and physiology.
Right. So if humans, see, we're saying only things with the human anatomy and physiology can think. Now, she just broke it down for us, Sarah. She said, the only things with a human anatomy and physiology are human beings. Now, that missing step bridges the gap, because when you say the only things that can do that are human beings, you're also at the same time saying that computers do not have a human anatomy and physiology. You see that? Computers do not have a human anatomy and physiology because of what she said. That's the missing step. And then now that leap across the Atlantic makes sense. We see the pilot and how he's moving. Because what he's saying is only things with a human anatomy and physiology can think, and this is the missing assumption, computers do not have a human anatomy and physiology, right? Therefore, computers cannot think. Do you see how there was something there that we were unconscious of, but logic helped us bring it out? And we made it transparent to ourselves, and now we're like, oh, now we got another thing to deal with. Because like, what's the missing thing? Computers do not have a human anatomy and physiology. There are two issues with that. The first is, do they have a human anatomy and physiology, or don't they? And second, what are the implications of that? Just because something doesn't have a human anatomy and physiology, does that imply that it can't think? Now that's another burden. There's all sorts of research you got to go through, consulting experts on AI, consulting experts on neuroscience. Do you see the burden I'm talking about if you're really thinking about things? These exercises are very important, guys, in consciousness awakening. If you're going to be woke, you're not going to jump in the streets because you heard something or saw something on TV. If you're woke, you do the opposite. You feel the burden, and you're like, I've got so much more reading and research to do before I even conclude anything, let alone take an action. All right, number 2, you have no control over the neurons in your brain. It follows that you have no control over anything you do. Someone please help us out here in the same way we did in the first one. I think there's a missing link there. Can anyone help us out with the missing link? Look, you have no control over the neurons in your brain. First of all, we don't know if that's true. We need to make sure we know what we mean by neurons and brain, right? As far as I understand, and I want to know if this is your understanding, our whole body is made out of cells. We are a multicellular organism. Therefore, even our brain, its tissue is made out of cells. But different parts of the body have different anatomies. And so the brain has special cells. Those are called neurons. Now, those neurons they are in a network of connections between themselves. What we call our brain is nothing but a huge network of neurons. I think I've heard something like a trillion. It's not a trillion neurons. I think it's something like a trillion connections in the brain, in an adult normal brain, like a trillion connections. Okay, so what are we saying? You have no control over the neurons in your brain. And then you jump over the Atlantic, and then it says, it follows that you have no control over anything you do. Is that a leap, or is there a missing link, or kind of like the first one? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's right. You have to make the link between, see, here, the first sentence is saying, you have no control over the neurons. Okay, now, okay, we understand, I don't know, okay. Guys, this is a burden. Who the hell is you? What is that? I remember in this class earlier, I asked you, are you comfortable with the idea that you are just a body? That was not an idle remark. It has implications. If you are just your body, okay, so when we say I, are we referring to one cell in you that's you? Are we referring to a network of cells? Okay, that's if you take the materialist route. I am nothing but matter. Now, what else could you be other than matter? What names do we typically refer to each other in a non-material aspect? Your soul, your mind, your spirit, right? Now, I have no idea what a soul or a mind or a spirit is objectively, right? Because you can't see it on an instrument unless you're engaged in some sort of psychic or paranormal thing. But under regular laboratory conditions, the soul is undetectable. But let's assume we understand what you mean by soul. Let's assume, okay? Now, even if there is this other thing called a soul, remember that this network of neurons, because it's all physical, remember they're networks, right? So there's what? Contact. So if we're talking about how one thing controls another, we can make sense of it materialistically because there's contact, right? But guys, if a soul is non-material, the very concept of contact doesn't exist. It takes a material thing to make contact with another material thing. So if you are truly your soul rather than your body, if that's the real you, when we refer to you, that's what we're referring to, we got to come up with a really interesting story of how your soul influences your body. When you raise your hand, if it's your soul that did that, now we've got a philosophical, you can tell reasons about, okay, you can give reasons about why things are the way they are. You can tell stories or give reasons about what something is, and you can tell stories or reasons about how things work. But guys, if you can tell a story about how souls influence bodies, you're up there. Your IQ is probably, Einstein, Kurt Gödel, or I don't know, something like that, man. Not even they could explain that. How can a non-material thing influence a material thing? The people who invented calculus, people like Leibniz, they couldn't explain it. Descartes certainly could. Einstein can't. I'm telling you all this so that you can feel the burden, right? Because that burden is what makes you ethical in a truly philosophical sense. People who don't feel the burden, they're the ones running around, making claims, getting heated, and rioting before they've thought about things. All right. Okay, you have no control over the neurons in your brain. And then the middle assumption is it's your neurons that control your actions or what you do. And so if you have no control of the neurons in your brain, and your neurons are the ones that control your actions and what you do, therefore it follows that you, whatever you are, have no control over anything you do. Does that make sense? Do you see the missing link that we provided? Does it make sense how that person got there and how logic helps bring out certain things? Now, once again, that middle part can be challenged, right? You have no control of the neurons in your brain, and your neurons control everything you do. That your neurons control everything you do, that's a burden. There's a burden of proof. How do you support that? Yeah, I'm not denying that for every action you do, there's some correlative activity in your neurons. There's something going on there. But to establish it as strict cause and effect, that's a burden. You can still be your soul doing it or something else. How do you show that? How do you exclude all other causes? Oh, and this last one is a good one, guys. I think that this last one is very common. Everybody does it, so I should be allowed to do it too. Very common, I think. So when you say, let's read that. Okay, so everybody does it. First of all, that's a burden, right? What do you have to show there? You are one person and you have 500 Facebook friends, and what are you claiming? Are you claiming that my 500 Facebook friends do it? Is that the claim? Everybody does it, right? Have you ever experienced everybody? Are you even the type of being that could experience everybody? So I just want you to feel the burden, feel the burn. Everybody does it. I have no idea how we would support that, all right? And then you leap across the Atlantic. So I should be allowed to do it too. That's the conclusion. How do you get from there to there? How do you get from everybody does it to I should be allowed to do it too? How do you get there? What's missing? Yeah, go ahead. Bingo. That's right. Everybody does it. Whatever everybody does should apply to me as well, so I should be allowed to do it. Guys, there are two things I want you to pay attention to. One is the burden I was telling you about. That's like, if you only took that from this whole class, I would have done my job. Like, seriously. I mean, the content we're going through is rich and very human, but that burden, only an elite number of people truly feel that burden. And I'm hoping that you will become part of that elite. If you go to seminary, if you go to law school, if you go to med school, the people who feel that burden, they're the ones who do the proper diagnosis of the patient, that differential diagnosis. People who feel that burden, they're the ones who look at the case law and the precedent and take the new case they're handling and differentiate it from all the other cases because they feel the burden. Do you see that? All right. Everybody does it, so I should be allowed to do it. Sounds like a kid talking. Right? It's the kind of thing someone would say to their mom. Everybody else in the neighborhood is playing after 7 p.m., so I should be allowed to do it. How do you justify such a thing? Again, what sort of theory of knowledge could support that claim? Yeah, that's axiology, right? Because we're talking about values. When you talk about permission, I should be permitted to do it. What you're secretly saying is it's right. It's not wrong for me to stay out, it's right. So what theory of knowledge gives us access to those kind of values? And then again, another part of the burden is how do we figure out whether that claim is objective or subjective? Okay. Do you have a hand up? All right, now some definitions. What in the world is an argument? Okay, an argument is a logical structure in which statements known as premises or assumptions are organized in order to persuasively support another statement known as a conclusion. Guys, That is the most abstract formula for what an argument is. All it is, it's a bunch of sentences or utterances or whatever that you're using to support some other thing. And logic is all about figuring out how does the structural arrangement between the assumptions and the conclusion support the conclusion? How does that happen? How does that logical force of persuasion happen? No, that's what logic is really all about. Now, there are two basic types of argument: deductive arguments and inductive arguments, all right? When we deduce something, to deduce a conclusion from other statements, to deduce it is to kind of like do like, you know those mathematical proofs, kind of like Pythagorean theorem or kind of thing? Yeah, all mathematical proofs are deductive logic or deductive arguments or deductive reasoning. So that means you assume certain axioms or certain principles, and all you do is you follow these first principles to their logical conclusion. Do you see that? You figure out what are the implications of this? What is their logical consequences? And all of a sudden it turns out that the two sides opposite the hypotenuse, if you do algebra correctly, you discover something that you wouldn't have necessarily seen in any, well, you wouldn't have known this about all right-angled triangles. That is, the square of the one side and the square of the other, when you add them together, they're equal to the square of the hypotenuse, right? That's what the power of deduction can do. It can synthesize a whole bunch of information that you would never experience in your lifetime. You see the power of that? You don't need to go and check every single right-angled triangle to see if Pythagorean theorem applies to it. Why? Because it's deductive. It applies universally and objectively and necessarily to every single right-angled triangle. So you don't need to use your senses, you don't need to observe, you don't need to measure, nothing. When you've proved that a right-angled triangle deductively has the quality that it does, you've just synthesized a whole bunch of information about an infinite number of triangles. But precisely because it's infinite, that means what? You'll never see all those triangles, yet it's a truth about all those triangles. So you've done something miraculous. You've synthesized something that you can never observe. And the thing you've just proved is not trivial. It's something interesting or profound. Just by observing a triangle, a right-angled triangle, you wouldn't have figured out that. But you can do a proof where you not only show those properties, but you show that they hold for any and all right-angled triangles. And that's beautiful. That's like saying, I can know stuff that I will never experience for myself. That's the beauty of deductive argument. And this is important because it's the ideal in philosophy. The ideal would be to provide a deductive proof of God's existence or non-existence. A deductive proof of why, why rape is wrong or why abortion is wrong. That's the ideal. Because why? It would apply to any and all cases of rape, and you wouldn't have to go case by case into the details figuring out whether or not it was right or wrong. There are also inductive arguments. And inductive arguments are basically like, look, they're limited to your experience. So, because they're limited to your experience, the assumptions you make are assumptions that have a limited sample size. You see that? And when they have a limited sample size, their ability to support the conclusion is not as strong as the ability of purely deductive arguments to support their conclusion. Do you see that? Does that make sense? All right. All right, so good deductive arguments are arguments where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises or the assumptions. Therefore, good deductive arguments are what we call valid. Guys, this word valid is very important. When we say valid in philosophy, just like arguments and essence, valid is a technical term. Philosophers use it in a very distinctive way. So when we say an argument is valid, what we're saying about that argument, when we say that it's valid, is that we're saying that if you assume the supporting statements are true, then the conclusion must be true, necessarily. When an argument has that structure, we call it a valid argument. And it's a kind of virtue or excellence of an argument. It's not all that you need, but it's one step there. When you have that, you're on your way. Oh my God, is it 7:50 already? Okay. This is good stuff, guys. Again, I know that we run behind a lot of times and we're a bit spontaneous, but this is the stuff that's really wholesome and nutritious for you. Don't worry, we'll catch up to the readings next week. We have to do teleological arguments and cosmological arguments, and then I think we're going to conclude with Leibniz's optimism that this is the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz is really short, so next class what we're going to do is we're going to get through this, and then we're going to jump right into all three of those readings. So for next class, be prepared with the reading on cosmological arguments by Aquinas, the reading by Paley on the teleological arguments, or the arguments from design, and then also read the Leibniz. And that's it. So we're gonna go ahead and finish here. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna take attendance, and that's it.